violin concerto. Peter, Tom, Andrew. What are the Tom? First with you. The title of the piece, Concentric Paths. Was that an important? Did that come before or after the composition of the concerto?
I'd have to go and consult my diary. I can't remember anything about it. It probably came sort of all three, but before, during, and after. I can't actually remember. I actually sometimes forget that it's got a title, this piece. It's becoming known as Violin Concerto, which is quite all right by me.
But the idea of concentricity, or rings, rounds...
Yes, well, I think I was...
Rings, paths and rounds, rather, in the individual movements.
I think I did want to point to how the material was, how I was thinking a little bit, and I'd noticed that what the movements had in common was a certain kind of circular thinking, and so I suppose that might be why the name kind of emerged.
Where does that circular thinking happening? Are you talking
all over the
structure,
place?
harmony,
Yes.
everything?
Oh, yes, all of the above. Yes.
Peter, is that important to you? Was that helpful to you when you were preparing this piece?
Yes, in a way it is. I mean, the thing with Tom's violin concerto is it's incredibly difficult. So you start by more basic things like trying to get around it and learn it, you know. And then after a while, and what struck me in the recording was what you mentioned when you had been talking about the radio signals from outer space, and that's sort of, I don't know, things I felt into places when I heard that.
Andrew Manze, radio signals?
Yes, it was a beautiful image for that beginning. In terms of the sort of patterns that go on, I find it's helpful when I start looking at a piece that I don't know to have some verbal clues like that, and that gets you looking. But after a while, you stop thinking about the verbal clues, and you're into the music, and then. By the time you reach the point of performing it, I personally wasn't thinking about the verbal thing at all, but I think it's helpful for the listeners to have those little, not clues, but little guides, just to hold on to something. And sometimes it's a question, especially if the listener is hearing the piece for the first time. You hope that maybe they'll listen to it more than once, because they'll pick up more and more as the more they listen to it. But you hope that maybe they'll get more from it because of those few verbal clues than they would have done without them. So in that sense,
I suppose it's a little bit of a signpost that you're sort of saying this direction to the listener, and it's obviously, as opposed to just calling it violin concerto, which implies a certain kind of linearity or structure or whatever it is, not something more rectangular, perhaps.
Brilliant. What are the things that you as performers, you especially Peter as a performer, were discovering the more you got to know the piece and the further you got into the notes? Is it possible to sum up the kinds of things that you discover and that you then want to communicate to us, the listeners?
Well, first of all, I find it incredibly beautiful. The second movement in particular, I just find it incredibly beautiful, and I also find that it reaches a lot of new audiences. I think it's a hit in concerts every time, I find, and it's quite rare, to be honest. With contemporary music, sometimes you feel it can be difficult the first time people hear things, maybe when they heard it the second or third time. But there's something immediately striking about this piece, both the virtuosity, of course, but the beauty, and also in the last movement there's some, I think that's it. It's got some X factor.
What about the expressive shape of the piece? The two shorter movements enclose that longer, slow movement. I mean, Tom, did that structure simply emerge as you were composing?
Yes, it's the way it sort of came about, really. I had a sense that the first movement was a sort of tuning up or tuning in of some kind. Can't really explain it. It's a fascinating problem about in the classical music, that the first movement so often contains all of the meat and of the argument, and then there's a slight feeling of wrapping up loose ends. And of course, this is always transcended by people like Beethoven, to say the least. But it is a sort of slightly. I've always found it slightly strange, and I wanted to investigate that. and see what would happen if one placed the weight somewhere else.
In the slow movement?
Yes, that's right, yes. And it does, I feel it's quite nice when we're in the slow movement or the second movement of something, it's still really doing something rather than in a sense of sort of divertimento. That it's really doing something which is part of the structure of the whole thing.
I mean, that's something that happens expressively as well. I mean, the way that slow movement starts, and then the first entry, the full orchestra, just that huge, loud, fortissimo chord. I mean, in a way, that's a strong symbol about the strength and size of utterance that slow movement is. I mean, Andrew, does that? How do you deal with that as a conductor? I mean, because in a way that's the beginning of a process which then has to last for 10 minutes. That whole moment.
Yeah, I love the slow movement. I love all of it, but I love the slow movement because there's a sort of I spent a lot of my life playing Baroque music, and you immediately have this huge sense of chaconne or passacaglia with the you maybe wouldn't hear it on first hearing, but there is this sort of repeating pattern. You could say almost like variations or something, but I don't want to use small words to describe big things. And so that moment, quite in the beginning where the orchestra crashes in, there's this huge noise, and then the music is going on and the crashes are marking out. They're like the telegraph poles that mark, and then the music is linking the telegraph poles. I find it incredibly exciting because you think that you'll never get anything stronger or deeper. You've got the lowest instruments on their lowest, you've got the loudest on their loudest, and the highest on their highest. It's a wonderful moment. But the piece goes further than that. I find the orchestration of this concerto is so wrapped up in the music itself that you can't separate the music and the orchestration. They are the same thing, I find.
You think particularly, I mean, there are great extremes of register. And okay, it's a chamber orchestra, but there's a tuba. It's unusual. There's a tuba in the chamber orchestra, for example. And that's part
and
of
the tuba
texture.
right down in its boots a lot of the time. It's wonderful.
Where do we end up, Peter, for you? Where does the concerto end up in rounds, the finale? What happens after that huge experience?
Back in outer space. The ending, I guess, it's just go back out there. No, I mean, it's... I agree with Andrew said with the second movement. It is also, for me as a player, and I think also visually for the audience, it is very high up, very far down, very fast. Contrasts, very beautiful, and it's a really super focused throughout.
There's a thing that occurs to me actually that might be of interest as a silent signpost, that the first thing that appeared in the music that I wrote was the melody at the beginning of the finale.
Oh, really?
And then, yes, and it just sort of came out of the air one night, and I think in this odd way that can be sometimes you write the rest of the concerto to try to explain what this melody's existence means in some way. That's sort of slightly explained. It needed this to other two movements before it to sort of then have this moment. Sort of, okay, now you're on stage, you know. So it's rather sort of. It's almost like the rest of it was just to appear just to prepare for the appearance of the star.
Yeah, I understand.
Odd the way these things then. I mean, I wouldn't then have thought it's going to produce this large slow movement, or that's just the way it came out.
Do you think we end up in outer space, as Peter says, Tom?
Well, it's I had a sort of alternative ending in my mind for a long time with that piece. There was a sort of ghost ending that never got written, that would just fade away, like a sort of the caravan passing on. But it wasn't to be. It just has to have this sort of this kind of circling round and then sort of crashes, or some whatever the word is. But it did have to have this kind of dramatic ending with everyone together. Yeah. I loved not really knowing to the last minute it was going to do that. I wasn't sure. It does.
Tom, Peter, Andrew, thank you very much.